chilling tales for dark nights.
The Pill Mills. Written by Scott Wilson. Performed here by Jason Hill. Chapter 8. I felt even better when I woke up in the morning. The tiny, dingy hotel room seemed like a small palace with its ancient tile floors and high ceiling. I somehow felt better, clearer, to know that George was, in fact, my enemy. I wondered if I could survive as an informant. Considering the fact that I was very worried that my boss might want me tied up to avoid loose ends, it might not be a horrible idea at all. Besides, the good times were killing me. I felt pretty anxious, and for once it had little to do with supernatural threats. I was about to spend the day working with someone who wanted me dead in the middle of a room filled with people willing to do it for nothing. The patients were wretches who were easy to laugh at, but even the most pathetic person alive can pull a trigger. They weren't the only ones with a certain nihilistic strength, though. I wondered why Chris hadn't been exposed to anything weird even after the close encounter with something trying to kill his friend. I was guessing at the time that it was almost certainly the lack of narcotics in his system. Something I had not yet confirmed but felt confident of, especially by his reaction to Grace's use. I was presuming some things I should have asked him, but I still felt more confident and less insane than I had in months, despite knowing my boss would probably like me to die. The hotel I was staying at was just off Avernia Street, a massive building for its time. It was built in 1921, with doors that looked almost medieval. Henry Flagler was so smitten with the Villa Zoyeda in St. Augustine that a powerful Moorish influence began to pervade much of his favorite architecture, and then slowly, but surely, architecture that he had nothing to do with. South Florida is filled with mission-style architecture largely because of this lasting influence. Even Flagler's home is strangely Hispanic-looking, considering the Anglo-American origins of its builders. It was abundant in the 1920s hotel, with massive dark brown tiles, stucco, and stone everywhere, nearly floor-to-ceiling windows, creaking floors, and very little electrical lighting or plumbing. My bathroom was small and had a clawed-foot bathtub and a wash basin that looked like it may have been original. It reminded me of the kind of apartments they have in New York City, especially with a higher view of the semi-urban sprawl. I put myself together and thought what a nice place to do drugs it was, but decided to keep it slim. I decided to take a good bit less Xanax that morning, coming down to just 2 milligrams. That's still enough to knock a normal human being unconscious with more ease than Benadryl could muster. But I knew that every minute of the day was going to go by with incredible anxiety that would make every second seem like an hour. The lobby of the hotel was massive, with huge pillars on the corners of the room. Almost everything was a shade of brown, tan, or beige, giving me the impression that the room was in sepia. The cracking stucco and massive stone floor made it look far more ancient than it was. It was barely lit, with small light bulbs here and there and nearly makeshift fluorescents fixed to the ceiling, which was up to 30 feet up in some places. The darkness was thorough, despite the small windows making it appear as if it were nearly nighttime. If there was a private eye smoking in a button leather chair, it would look like a tropical noir movie. This was in contrast to the explosion of turquoise and violent pink clouds that loomed outside. Chris and I were planning on meeting at the end of the week, and I had to make a fast decision about whether I would continue working there and try and uncover the mystery, or if I should prepare for some truly brutal withdrawals and a proffer from the FBI. This was where the FBI offers one protection from prosecution in exchange for information on one's employers or dealer or whatever. I decided to take a walk from the hotel to the seawall, about a 20-minute walk each way, despite the fact that the bright turquoise and pink sky indicated it was still early morning. Somehow, I felt bold, possibly by the thought of fucking over George, possibly because I felt more secure knowing that Chris was a potential ally. The area just north of the tightly packed new buildings featuring luxury lofts and obnoxious bars and boutiques known as City Place was filled with older buildings. They often had wood floors and sported either utilitarian box shapes or were grand structures with nuanced detail in every alcove and column. The people were similar enough, either pointlessly wealthy or outrageously poor, and at night they either panhandled or moved between clubs and stores. I've heard it's gotten a little nicer, but there are still a lot of homeless. The entire expanded area of downtown West Palm Beach had far more high-rise buildings, and it ran along a stretch of seawall that was always a great place for a walk. I made my way away from the hotel and towards Makeb's, a small bagel restaurant near the well-bubbled Christian university that lurked off of Okeechobee Boulevard. There were plenty of people out that morning, business people going to work at the many law firms near the massive semi-arch-shaped courthouse that loomed over the district, or just walking their dogs, or begging for change. A kid bumped into me after just about 2 blocks while riding his skateboard. Aside from that, no one interacted with me at all. He didn't turn around or say anything, and from the way people looked at me, I was guessing, perhaps, I could have shaved or done something better with my hair this morning. I reached Makeb's and thoroughly enjoyed an egg and salami sandwich to go, on the seawall I was closest to. This was a practice enjoyed in some way or another by almost everyone living in the area. The waterfront view was amazing, and the architecture of some of the old churches and other elderly buildings interrupting the skyline once every other block or so made it feel like the modern era had somehow only invaded West Palm Beach. Art Deco, Spanish influences, and high-rise condominiums and offices were wrapped in a light turquoise and pink from the reflections of the sky they offered, and framed with a dark green of ubiquitous palm trees. Some people went to the seawall, some people had views from their desks, and some just enjoyed the brief drive from Okeechobee that happened to touch the water. But it was hard not to take a deep, relaxing breath in whenever one saw the water. I felt much better, almost like a normal human being. I was walking up a massive artificial hill near an amphitheater about the size of a football field when I began to even smile and say good morning to passers-by. I was greeting a particularly delighted Lhasa Apsu, a beautiful woman in yoga pants, was walking when I felt a sharp smack on my back. The sound of wheels on the sidewalk pointed me to the kid who had hit me earlier while riding his skateboard, who was catching up with a few friends who had skated ahead. He was wearing a backwards baseball cap with the UM logo on it, and carrying what looked like a bright blue and yellow hat in his hand. He didn't bother apologizing again as he sped up to join his friends, who had found a concrete staircase perfect for mischief. The woman and her dog continued on, obviously weirded out. I turned up Clematis Street, where restaurants, clubs, and boutiques entirely different than the ones that existed the month previously had confidently sprung up, and the workers were preparing the outside eating areas for a brunch crowd that wasn't deterred by weekdays. I wondered what it would feel like to go to the gym in the mornings or something. It was feeling like an incredible day when I suddenly realized I was going to be low on opiates soon, and therefore at risk of God knows what. I reached into my pocket to grope for my stash when I suddenly felt a shocking pain in my back and a strange sensation of falling on my face. I hit a small rise in the cement outside the shop hard, my vision filled with stars. I could tell from the sharp pain and tastes of pennies flooding my mouth that I had bitten down on my tongue. The kid whirled past me, his wheels making a low, almost innocuous growl on the sidewalk. This time, he whipped his board around to face me. There was nothing weird about him at all. A small teenager, with a crisp-looking plaid shirt and hipster jeans. He had a mop of brown hair under his cap and light blue eyes. He picked up his board and held it under one arm, while holding what was apparently not a hat, but a bright blue and yellow striped mask in the other hand. The shape of its face was clearly that of an ibis or wood stork, and what I thought was a bill previously tapered off into a thin but brightly colored beak. It looked like slick stone, almost as if it had the scintillating appearance of some kind of opal. The small group of skateboarders waited on the man-made hill that separated Clematis from the street that ran through City Place. He had a smug grin on his face. I got up as fast as I could, shambling back and into some railing, surprising a waiter. I heard a few of the kids snicker. I walked away from them at an incredible pace, turning 90 degrees right away and pretending I had somehow not seen them at all. I managed to get back to the safety of other junkies in the hotel in record time, keeping my head down and not looking behind me whenever I heard wheels on the sidewalk. I didn't see them after I rounded the next block and finally made it to the street with my hotel in view. A pixie-like young girl with dyed gray-blue hair wearing a bright orange tank top and dark blue and turquoise paisley swimming trunks sat on a bench opposite the hotel, next to a homeless man who smiled at her happily. She had a large, dark red and seafoam green mask on her lap, and even from that distance I recognized the fat diamond shape of a gator's head. I stayed indoors another couple of hours and called in late. I hurried to my car and tried not to check if anyone was following me. As I began to wait for another week to end, I hoped to avoid my coworkers and patients while I read books on Native American myths Chris gave me obsessively. Debbie was standing behind the desk talking to Aaron when I came in. She turned and smiled to me, but Aaron had a much less happy face as he sank behind his check-in counter.
Good morning. Great to see you again.
I muttered some kind of greeting, but her saccharine attitude and Aaron's obvious displeasure was making the FBI seem like a great idea already. Good morning. I smiled weakly and nodded to Aaron quickly to avoid prolonged eye contact.
Could I ask you a question really quick?
She turned and walked back to her office, not bothering to wait for a response. Aaron nodded back to me but seemed more distracted by a small pull in his bright fuchsia skin-tight shirt. Or maybe he was looking for an excuse to show his abs to the young girls at the front of the incoming group of patients. I waddled to Debbie's office, hoping this was going to be something not creepy.
Dave wanted to talk to you. When's a good day for you?
Mondays are inherently fucking terrible. How about later this week? Maybe Friday? If I could bring him to my next meeting with Chris, maybe we could share some insight onto whether or not they were trying to kill me again.
Sounds great. Also, I hate to ask, but could you help work the desk today? I'm feeling a little under the weather.
This made me quietly furious, as I had planned to hide from the patients and smoke pot whenever possible that day. The lack of Xanax was making me feel deeply stressed. After nodding dutifully, I marched back to the front. Within minutes, patients had already filled the disgusting lobby. I was about to get to work filing patients into the computer system when I noticed a young lady who looked like she had been crying much more than usual. Her ringleader was an alpha douche, short, with a thick Tom Selleck-style mustache, tall black cowboy boots, stained black trucker hat, tight black denim pants, and a camouflage tank top to show off Confederate flags and eagles on wiry-looking arms. He was chewing tobacco and motioned for his friends to stand back before he leaned the upper half of his body over the counter and motioned for me to talk to him.
Bro, I got $50 if you can help get me out of here a little quicker.
While it was common to offer money or anything else to get ahead, it was rare for someone to assume that $50 would make me happy to see him. He was about 5'6", but had the confidence of a man who was both taller and less inbred. I nodded, not wanting to say anything because I hated the man already and didn't want it to become obvious. I moved his file ahead in the doctor's waiting area and tried to put the two feminine names in the back so that I could talk to the girl who seemed distraught. She had frumpy brown hair tumbling over a powder blue tank top and blue jeans, and it looked like she had been crying the entire ride down. I couldn't see her eyes because she was staring at the ground the whole time, but she wouldn't leave this little creep's side. Byron James! I called the little twerp into the second waiting room where he slipped me a small greasy wad of money that I would bet anything didn't add up to 50. He marched happily into his appointment and left the crying girl in the waiting room, as well as the 6.5-foot muscular skinhead that was apparently named Ashley. The look on my face when he confirmed this must have been priceless because both everyone in the main lobby cracked up when I called him in. I made sure Ashley had his appointment first, leaving the weeping girl sobbing quietly in the corner. I took care of something in the office to give her a couple minutes before approaching her to make sure, at least, someone asked her if she was in immediate danger. I made it look like I was inspecting files when I suddenly noticed that there were no more files left for her groom. That could mean that she was just a tag-along, but I wasn't feeling great about my odds. Thoroughly creeped out, I backed away. As I moved away from the files and the girl, I noticed that she was no longer crying, and I felt confident that if I turned around, I would see her staring at me. I turned to go back to the office, but heard her first move, then get out of the chair at a cautious pace. When I reached the office door, I could see her standing out of my peripheral vision, facing me away from the doctor's doors in the hallway. I was starting to get a little creeped out, so I decided not to ask her any more questions and shut the door behind me. I sat at my desk until I noticed them leaving 10 minutes later. "Thanks for the help, bro." Byron James was clearly thrilled as he held up his prescriptions and threw me a peace sign before handing the prescriptions to Aaron to be filled. His crew shuffled out behind him, one at a time. I couldn't help but watch them. After Ashley lumbered out of the door, I still expected the girl to file behind them. The spring attached the door quietly but promptly moved it shut after Ashley passed. Aaron got up and walked through the second waiting room to get the counter where the doctors placed bottles of medication in their completed paperwork. The second waiting room was empty too. Byron got his medication quickly and began chatting up a pretty blonde while he waited for his lackeys to get their medications and sort out their agreed trades with other junkies in the parking lot and bathroom line. I went back to work in earnest, scanning files and trying not to notice how many had their records shipped to this and that place because the Narcan didn't come soon enough. "Psst, hey bro." I could hear the sleaze dripping from his voice. Without turning around, I knew Byron was leaning over the counter again, taking advantage of Aaron's brief absence to be even more of a douche than necessary. The problem with taking money from junkies was that they assumed that either you were cool or that you needed money enough to get favors from. Either invited further conversation. "I got some good friends and shit, and I was thinking, maybe you could, help them get through faster. I love coming here and all, but these lines, you know?" He paused his bullshit to gauge my reaction to take a long sip from his tall boy of chelada, a surprisingly refreshing mix of clamato, beer, spices, and lime juice. As I turned from my desk, I saw the girl again. She was sitting in the lobby now, directly next to the pretty blonde Byron had attempted to fraternize with. Sheila Mae Cassidy was her name, according to her file. She was staring at Sheila with a wide-eyed expression of shock and rage. Her cheeks were still wet, and her pale, oval-shaped face was starkly beautiful. Framed by tangles of brown hair that looked incredibly frizzy and as if they hadn't seen a brush in years, her weeping made her blue-green eyes look particularly vivid. From the angle she was sitting, I noticed that she had a dark, red, wet stain on her crotch. Sure, whatever. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. I turned away from Byron, who looked triumphant despite my failing to meet his high five. I had almost talked to her. No one else seemed to notice her except for a fat old biker who had put down his Mountain Dew and was now moving cautiously toward the door. I sank down into a brown folding chair and lit up a joint, despite being barely obscured. Later on that day, I would get a call asking for Sheila's file and any information about her. It was PBSO this time, not a distant sheriff. Some officers came by to ask us about her too, but were tight-lipped about why. According to the news, they found the lower half of her body outside of a La Quinta. I found a couple of tiny tufts of blonde hair in the waiting rooms and outside the next day. I didn't want to take any more Xanax, so I decided to drink some NyQuil just to be on the safe side. I got away from my desk and went to the back door that met the alley behind our Chunkitarium. and told Aaron that I needed a quick break for a joint, prompting him to nod and put out his cigarette. After smoking a couple of joints and drinking a little more NyQuil, I staggered out of my folding metal chair. I wanted to simply feel nothing. I went into Debbie's office to see if maybe she had some shrooms or something, but her office was empty. The door to the second waiting room was closed, and I noticed her car keys were missing, so I assumed she had run out. Her office had a single small fluorescent light that she ignored in favor of a tidy-looking desk lamp. It was the only thing tidy about the office, with papers everywhere, and the walls covered in stupid posters and framed pictures of her and her friends. After rummaging around in her desk for a few minutes, I found a few shrooms, a small bag of pills, some coke, and a lot of half-finished paperwork. Since I was already shamelessly rifling through her shit on the pretense of being in the back for an innocent narco break, I decided to look through it. Behind some unfinished attempts at lying to the DEA about diversion practices, there were some pictures that she had developed. They were from work and her house, and seemed to be from the same group as the ones on the wall. I even saw one of me, looking wasted at her house. That was when I noticed the one of her drinking a beer in the Gold Ring pub with a friend. Her friend was a young man wearing a blue t-shirt and smiling awkwardly into the camera as Debbie flaunted her massive Silicon Valley in a black tank top. The young man was the young man who I saw dressed nicely, with a bolo tie, asking for help. In some of the pictures, he was helping out with paperwork at American Injury Clinic, the behemoth narco factory that was George's flagship. I wondered if I had been his replacement. For the first time in years, withdrawal seemed like a better option than continuing the many, seemingly intertwined risks. When I got to my desk, I began to Google news investigations to see if I could find the names of the prosecutors or agents specifically involved. I went back to work a lazy half-hour later, longer than usual, but not enough to raise eyebrows. Debbie came back an hour later with slightly darker skin than she left and a frappuccino. I felt a twinge of disgust when she smiled at me, and the blunt trauma of betrayal made it difficult to focus on anything else. I began to scan files again, now keeping an eye out for names. Anything that seemed familiar, I tried to file away. The lack of Xanax was helping quite a bit. I wondered what a proffer from the FBI would actually look like.
Wilkes, can I talk to you for a second?
Jessica's voice came from her medication room, directed at no particular direction. I happily shambled back to the only consistently clean room in the clinic.
Grace and I were talking, and she mentioned that she never heard from you.
She trailed off, expecting an answer, but I didn't have one. After calling the first number, Chris's, I was happily under the impression that Grace was something to avoid. When did you talk to her? The pit was already forming in my stomach before I began to ask the question. I quickly hoped that she had called her and that there was a strange story behind it to confirm that something had happened to Grace.
We went out shopping the other day. She works at Neiman Marcus on the island and gets a killer discount. I guess she hasn't heard from Chris in a while. Did you manage to get a hold of him?
I shook my head, not knowing what to say. I felt like the room was suddenly 30 degrees colder. No, I'll call Grace though. Some stuff happened, I need some time to chew on things. Jessica looked dead serious and nodded at the ground, seeming genuinely sympathetic.
You look like you've lost weight and cleaned up a bit lately.
Thanks. I had actually gained weight. I'm a stress eater and wasn't taking the lack of Xanax and opiates well, although my bowel movements were a lot better. But I was wearing clean clothes and didn't smell, so I took it as a genuine compliment. I awkwardly shuffled away from the beautiful girl. I wondered why whatever Chris was would give me books and talk to me instead of eating or killing me. I wondered what relation he had to the other things I had seen. I wondered if maybe Jessica had gone shopping with the still-moving corpse of something that used to be Grace. I couldn't think clearly enough to even imagine a scenario that might tie it all together. The next day, I wasn't taking the decrease in Xanax and creepy kids outside my hotel very well. I hadn't seen them again, but I also hadn't ventured outside during the night or morning and kept the blinds shut. Sure enough, by the next time the morning started in earnest, I felt as if I had had 4 cups of coffee and was ready to scream every time anyone made even the slightest traffic error. When I got to the clinic, the parking lot was filled with beaten-down vehicles that were packed like clown cars filled with junk aficionados, many with towels or blankets over the windows to keep the light out while the occupants slept. Some of them stood in circles, forming small narcotic stock markets as middle dealers debated how many of which pills would be best to trade off with others. Many people would get killed over deals made in that parking lot. Entire fortunes came and went every day, usually in cars worth less than $3,000. The strip mall with the pill mill faced another strip mall on the other side of the parking lot, which looked like a flea market for narcotics. I tried not to pay attention to their stares as they whispered angry speculations as to when they could expect to finally get in and get their medications. Before I made it to the door, I suddenly recognized an increase in volume from the back of the lot, and finally the telltale yelps of Hicks shouting. I took my cell phone out of my pocket and ran towards it, texting Debbie to send Aaron out as I went. When I got to the noise, I saw a ring of filthy human backs with heads pointed towards whatever was in the center of that ring. If they were fighting, especially over drugs, a lot of people could easily be going to jail if the cops had to come break it up. The wall of backs was too densely packed to see around. "Come the fuck on, people!" I yelled, hoping that someone would want medication badly enough to have some interest in helping get the two combatants apart. They ignored me, other than a few frightened faces turning to glance at me before focusing again on whatever was in the center of the circle. They did this while backing away. I could hear a gurgling and cracking noise over their frightened yelps and calls to relatives nearby. I pushed my way between an obese biker with a Confederate and American flag on his black leather vest and a skinny man with thin black hair who looked like he had more junk than food lately. The skinny man looked horrified and was shaking violently. He recognized me and pointed to the center of the action before backing away with a frightened babble. There, in the center of the human filth, I saw him. An old, tall, and very fat man. His face turned away from me, struggled to get up with the help of his cane. His bright yellow long-sleeve shirt and khakis were covered in blood. I looked around and couldn't see anyone near him, much less an obvious assailant. I saw Aaron picking up the pace from a slow jog to a quick sprint towards us, so I cautiously broke through the ring wall. "All right, everyone, just calm down. We're going to get this man medical attention." "Sir? Sir, do you need help walking?" I asked as calmly as I could and hoped he didn't. That looked like a lot of blood. I heard a strange gurgle and more cracking, and the people facing the man as he finally got his feet cringed and backed away. When he turned around, I could see why. It was a fat old man named Ted, who was the ringleader for a particularly scummy group. He regularly tried to get as many young girls as possible hooked and turning tricks. Red gore dripped down from his chin, and everything around his mouth was smeared red. Gleaming white shards poked from between the red flow of blood from his mouth. He appeared to be grinding his teeth, using every ounce of force the muscles in his jaw could allow to force what was left of his mouth to grind together, shattering and uprooting several teeth in the process. He stared at me with a glazed-over, peaceful look. Please help me." Each word came out with a small spray of blood and shattered teeth fragments. Veins bulged on the sides of his head, but he had a calm, almost serene look in his eyes. He swung his cane forward and began to walk towards me with his hands outstretched for help. What was left in his mouth was so broken down it resembled shattered bits of porcelain draped in his own gore. He lurched towards me to take my hand while I slowly walked to him before I felt two strong arms on my shoulders yanking me back. "Let's go," Aaron shouted directly into my ear and practically threw me in the other direction. I walked, slowly at first, towards the clinic door until Aaron gave me another shove and jogged past me. I saw the junkies shamble quickly to their cars at the front doors of the clinics. I heard a deep gurgle some yards behind me and picked up the pace when a scream rang out. The skinny man with black hair had been cornered by the bleeding fat man after he ran into an alcove in the strip mall across the way. He didn't realize it was a dead end, with a small concrete block corner that was frequently used by junkies for sleeping, shooting up, and turning tricks. When I reached the strip mall columns, I saw him in the tinted reflection. He had tried to move around the fat man, who fell down in an attempt to grab him. I could see the front of the skinny man's shirt was covered in blood from the fat man spraying. I ran inside the clinic and tried to act normal behind the desk. As I got to the door, I forced myself not to turn my head to see a kid with something brightly colored in their hands, standing at the end of the strip mall walkway, staring at me. An hour or so later, when the police one of our neighbors called finally showed up, they found the fat man crumpled in an unwindowed cement corner. I saw them dragging a bag out, but I heard later that the police were asking people if anyone hit him, because, apparently, most of the bones in his body had been broken. The tall, skinny man never got to the front door, but someone he was with was asking if anyone knew where he had gone to. Apparently, he told them happily not to worry about him and strolled right out of the parking lot instead of getting his meds and going back to Kentucky, where his family was waiting. The next day, I almost felt like praying for peace and quiet. The small hotel room was beginning to feel less unique and cool and more threatening, and I checked every kid with a skateboard to see if they had a mask as well. I waited until there wasn't a hint of the nuclear colors of dawn that cover Florida and began to get ready in a small, ancient bathroom where I shaved using a razor that I had bought at Publix instead of some shitty old electric for the first time in years. I wasn't used to the sight of my face without stubble left over. I drove quickly to the clinic, wanting to get the day over with. In the clinic, someone had put Stranger Than Fiction on instead of the action movies that patients typically enjoyed, and some deeply sad song was playing while Will Ferrell had a pensive, frustrated look on his face. I walked into the front office and saw Debbie waiting for me in front of the door with a second waiting room linked the front office to everywhere else. "Dave wanted to know if he could meet you tonight instead of later." Debbie confronted me out of the blue before I was able to sit down, speaking matter-of-factly. I kind of have something. It's actually really important. Could we do it tomorrow?" I needed at least a little while to chew on things. "He actually needs to see you tonight." She smiled pleasantly and spoke in a soft but slightly happy voice. I wondered if it was just another meeting, which wouldn't be atypical, or if I was about to die. Or maybe Chris would kill me before I even got there. I nodded and sat down at my desk without a word. She went to chat with Aaron about some guy who hit on her while she was on a gambling boat with Chris. Patients began to pour in when Aaron finally flipped the lock and I was safely filing useless paper. It occurred to me that it might be possible to discreetly contact authorities and maybe get some help. I remembered the name of the detective who I had read were investigating a pill mill they managed to close down south. After an hour or so, I Googled the name on my phone and brought up a number. While sitting on the toilet, pretending to be horrifically constipated due to opiates, like normal, I texted a Detective Juan Roa that I was working for George and needed to talk to him discreetly. I got a text back asking what time and place I would feel comfortable with and responded that tonight would be great and that I would get back to him on the location. He agreed and I flushed the empty toilet. Before I could reach the doorknob, my phone rang. It was Chris. I stared at it, disbelieving. It continued to ring, and I muted it and sat back down in the closed toilet seat. I went to the voicemail and instantly began to ring again. This was clearly happening one way or the other. Hello? Tell them to meet you at Bryant Park after sundown. Chris's sharp voice cut me off before I could even finish the word hello. It was followed by the screen on my phone telling me the call had ended. I stood up, my knees shaking, and almost instantly fell down. I got back up, feeling weak and nauseous. A combination of a lack of drugs and too much supernatural shit was getting to me. After finally getting up, I threw cold water in my face repeatedly and texted Dave that I was going to be at Bryant Park, where I decided to lie and say I was staying nearby after dark. He asked if I could do it earlier, and I told him I had promised my mother something. He agreed, and I went back to the office, moving slowly and carefully. My shoulder and back ached horribly after 2 bad falls in a short period of time. In the front office, Aaron and Debbie stopped talking when I entered the room and looked at each other. Aaron smirked a little while Debbie looked depressed, staring down at the floor and leaving the room instead of making eye contact with me. At the end of the day, I felt weak from having been sitting terrified all day, wondering what was going to happen to me. I took a long look at the clinic before heading out to the park to wait for sunset.
Chilling tales for dark nights.